Our second speaker this afternoon is Dr. Adam Purziger. And Adam Purziger is a senior lecturer at the Department of Jewish Studies and Contemporary Judaism in Bridal University. His publications concentrate on Jewish religious movements in the 19th century in Europe and in the US. He's especially interested in Jewish responses to secularism. In 2013, Dr. Purziger was a visiting scholar at Wolfson College in the UK, where he headed a research group working on the theology of Jewish orthodoxy in the 20th century. Dr. Purziger will speak about blurred boundaries, religious identities within contemporary American Jewish families. בבקשה.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon or evening to everybody. This is very unusual for me. I'm usually speaking in Hebrew in places far away from my home in Israel, or speaking in English in places further away from my home. I live in Kfar Saba. I basically fell out of bed. I hope I don't look awake enough. And just, you're going to set up my little picture. Okay. Anyway, it's very nice to be here and very nice to be with these wonderful colleagues. I think there'll be a lovely segue from Professor Kaplan's talk to my own. I do want to say in particular that Uri Kalt, who was one of the main organizers of this conference in his position here, is a former student of mine, and there is no greater pleasure for a teacher than somebody who maintains a connection, and we continue to be in dialogue with each other and hope that that will be the case in the future as well. The picture I wanted to start with, there's no big PowerPoint presentation, is a very famous picture that many of you probably saw a couple of years back, which is the chuppah, the bridal canopy of Marc Mezvinsky and Chelsea Clinton. As you recall, Chelsea Clinton, the closest thing to Princess Diana in America, married her college sweetheart from, Beau from Stanford University. And they married under a chuppah with the rabbi from Yale University with a ketubah. Not only that, but Marc was wearing a talit and he was wearing a kippah. And when I saw that picture, I thought to myself, well, how are people reacting to this? And there were a lot of reactions, but I'll just talk about two. One reaction for people who were very fearful of assimilation and of the disappearance of the Jewish people and are very vigilant in that regard is, oh my goodness, this is horrible. This is the decline of American Jewry. How could there be anything worse than this? And this was a very strong, visceral one. And I'm coming here as an academic. I'm not here to project or to put forward any agenda. But that is certainly one position that was taken. The other one, which I think Americans understood intuitively, but Israelis had a much harder time with, was we made it. Wow. This is the ultimate, this is the most important event in the history of American Jewry. When a young man can marry the daughter of the president and the Secretary of State, future president possibly, in full daylight, wearing his kippah and his talit with his rabbi under a chuppah, well, the project of American Jewry, what is the ultimate project of American Jewry? In many ways, the project is integration. Acceptance, and here the segue from Marion from Professor Kaplan's talk is wonderful. This is the ultimate expression in many people's eyes of the fact that Jews have been accepted totally into American society. Now I want to take that a step further, and here I can hypothesize, because we don't know yet, Marc and Chelsea still don't have any children. So my guess is that they are not members of a synagogue. But based on Marc's background and the way he chose to celebrate his wedding, it's very likely that when his child reaches an age when religion becomes a factor, he will want to be a member of a synagogue. So in a certain way, for this talk, Marc and Chelsea and their future family, Bezrat Hashem, right? Their future family is sort of the model for the type of people that I want to speak about today in this talk. Mixed American Jewish families that are active in Jewish life. Now, 2/3 of the Jews who intermarry bring up their children without a strong Jewish identity. But 1/3 brings up their children with a very strong, or attempts to develop a strong Jewish identity. And those people tend to join synagogues. And they're really interesting, and I've been studying them for a few years, and I want to share with you some of the data that I've looked at, and integrate it with some more recent statistical data that's come out of the Pew Report. I'm going to read just a page and a half, just to give us a strong, grounded introduction, and then I'm going to go back to a more oral, face-to-face presentation, and hopefully we'll have time after our third distinguished speaker for some dialogue as well. Okay. On May 5th, 1964, Look magazine ran a cover story entitled The Vanishing American Jew, 1964. The article predicted that due to low birth rates and intermarriage, the American Jew would disappear by the end of the 20th century. While this pessimistic forecast has by no means come to fruition, there is no doubt that the author was astute in locating intermarriage as one of the central themes of late 20th century and early 21st century American Jewish life. At the time, it was estimated that less than 15% of American Jews married non-Jews. By 1990, the figure was between 40 and 50%. While the recently published Pew Institute study of American Jewry suggests that the rate remains a little above 50%. More acutely, if we take out the Orthodox from that equation, the figure balloons to 71%. In plain terms, that means that more than 2 out of every 3 American Jews who marry this year will choose a non-Jewish spouse. Among those who intermarry, the vast majority, as I said, 2/3, do not bring up their children as Jews. Thus, there is no question that intermarriage continues to deplete the numbers of American Jewry. It comes as no surprise that much of the broader communal efforts regarding intermarriage were initially geared towards preventing it altogether. By the 1990s, however, there arose greater recognition that even if a minority, there was still a considerable number of mixed families that were bringing up their children as Jews. As the intermarriage rate has risen then, so has the place of mixed families within Jewish life. In fact, within a rapidly increasing number of non-Orthodox synagogues in America, the majority of members are married to non-Jews. 2 of the more well-known and controversial religious issues that have been addressed regarding such families are whether rabbis should be allowed to perform or participate in mixed weddings, and the Jewishness of the children of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. In each case, the Reform movement has been the most radical in traversing formerly universally accepted boundaries, both permitting its rabbis to perform mixed marriages and recognizing the Jewishness of patrilineal children. In the following, I will focus on another issue that was touched upon at varying points throughout the century, the 20th century, but has become an increasingly central one in the past decade: the status of members of mixed families who are not Jewish according to religious standards and do not want to convert. Specifically, I will concentrate on the emerging efforts to create new categories within Jewish life that recognize the relationship of such individuals to Judaism without conferring on them normative Jewish identity. my central argument is that, especially due to the critical role of the synagogue for sustaining Jewish life in America, the creation of a new category of Jewish identity within the synagogue has broad implications for the nature and future of American Jewish life in general. Okay, so that was the more formal part. And so we're looking at these mixed families in which there are people who are non-Jewish members of the family. And we're focusing on those ones who want to be Jewish and want their children to grow up with a Jewish identity. And therefore, we're going to be focusing on the synagogue. And that is because, as I'll go back to it later on, it's clear from all the studies that the best chance to bring up your child as a Jew in America is if you are a member of a synagogue. And that is a very important statistic, because another statistic from the Pew Report is, of all the segments of American Jewry today, the fastest growing one is called, not Orthodox, unaffiliated. Okay? Unaffiliated, not connected to a synagogue or to a movement, a religious movement, is the fastest growing group in America, but that is not the group that I want to focus on in my talk here. So just a few words about the synagogue. And this is very important for Israelis. For American Jews, traditionally, certainly throughout most of the 20th century, what I like to say to my students is synagogue membership was like citizenship. Professor Kaplan talked about 3-day-a-year Jew. It didn't matter if you went to the synagogue 3 days a year, but you paid dues, you paid membership, and you showed up. And you might be involved in other activities in the synagogue center, as Mordechai Kaplan and his students tried to develop, where a synagogue was not just a place to pray, it was a place for social activities, athletic activities, literary, intellectual activities, etc. And this really followed the traditional Protestant model in America as well. We talk about these concepts of a family that prays together, stays together, one nation under God, in God we trust. America is not a very pious nation, but it is a very religious nation. Religion is a significant element in fundamental American identity. It's something that people who focus on the coasts and Chicago don't really appreciate. The first person to appreciate this was Alexis de Tocqueville when he studied, in his book Democracy in America, and he recognized that a non-coercive democracy was breeding a much more religious nation than was Christian or Catholic France. And this was written in 1833, 1832. Okay, so the synagogue is the place. It's not the only place. Today there are many other ways to express your Judaism. There always were, but somehow the synagogue has long been a focal point for positive identification, whether one was particularly observant or almost not observant at all. A movie, and I think popular culture, because Jews are so involved with cinema, is sometimes a wonderful thing, sometimes it's overstated, but a lovely way to see that is in the movie from about 20 years ago, Driving Miss Daisy, who's the Southern belle who is very assimilated, and yet her synagogue is important. When there's a bomb there, it becomes a major affair. So how do synagogues, and I'm not focusing here on Orthodox synagogue, I'm focusing on liberal synagogues, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist. Ooh. Do I get a little more time because of the technical? Yeah, I get a few minutes for that, I think. Okay, so good. Uri, right? We're going to get the, thank you. So, how do synagogues deal with mixed couples? So there's a history here. Initially, if you married a non-Jew, and I'm talking about Reform and certainly conservative synagogues, you couldn't be a member of the synagogue. That's in the early 20th century. By the second half of the 20th century, by the 1950s, 60s, the Jewish member of the family could be a member, but the non-Jewish family member could have nothing to do with the synagogue. Not only that, but the Jewish member could not be a chazan, could not lead the services, could not be an officer. Subsequently, things begin to change, and just to move ahead quickly, a major turning point is the 1980s. In the 1980s, people realized that the numbers of intermarried couples are going up, and particularly within liberal congregations, there is an ideological bent to things. We want to bring up our kids Jewish, and there's also a practical, financial aspect to this. If congregations are going to sustain themselves, then they have to find a way to be inclusive rather than exclusive. It's a complicated equation. It really doesn't matter, though, in the end. It's what results from these evolutions. We have, let's say, in the conservative movement, there's something called the Kiruv Committee. Not Kiruv to Jews, like among Orthodox, but Kiruv, meaning to bring mixed families in. And there's these debates and different strategies that are developed. And then, for the first time, we start hearing about new terms. People talk about, why don't we call a non-Jewish wife a friend of God, or a b'nai Noach, or a ger toshav, or a yirat Hashem, a fearer of God. Why don't we find ways to make them feel that even if they're not Jewish, we understand they're also not typical Gentiles. Usually, at that point, the aim is that if we're nice to them, eventually they'll want to convert, and then they'll be full-fledged Jewish families, etc. So even then, they recognize that this is really a slippery slope. Jerome Epstein is a very major conservative rabbi. He said, it is important that appropriate avenues should be sought for suitable roles for involvement in the ceremony should the parent desire. This is talking about a non-Jewish parent. These roles should affirm the individual's vital position as a parent, but must not misleadingly convey any sense that that person is Jewish. So there's a real sort of ambivalence that's going on here. And this really reflects much of the discourse on this issue within conservative and reform synagogues in the 1990s. In the 21st century, we've really moved further. In the 21st century, it's the sense is that it's accepted that there will be a large percentage of members of the community who are not of the synagogue who are not Jewish. They will be very involved in synagogue life, and we have to respect them, and not only respect them. And here's where we get back. Here we get back to the two ways of looking at Marc and Chelsea. We have to appreciate their contribution to our synagogue life. We have to appreciate that in America, in pluralistic, multicultural America, the idea of having mixed families may indeed be something that enriches our synagogue life, and therefore we have to deal appropriately. Ed Case, who's the head of something called Interfaith Family, he says telling a non-Jewish parent that he or she cannot have an aliyah because he or she isn't included in the us is destructive and counterproductive. Intermarried non-Jews want to be accepted as they are. They want to be comfortable in the synagogue. They want to feel united with their Jewish spouse and children, etc. Rabbi Michael Sternfeld from Chicago's Sinai congregation says, maybe we should simply stop trying to say who qualifies and who does not. Instead, we should be asking who can be counted on, whether they identify with the aspirations and values of the Jewish people. I would rather draw boundaries based upon whether someone is an Ohev Yisrael, a lover of the Jewish religion, than based upon the purity of their religious commitments or the purity of their DNA. So here we have much stronger efforts to create new categories. There is still this sense that There's something called halakha, whether it be Orthodox halakha, conservative halakha, Reform halakha. There's still the sense that, well, if we want to have any relationship to the state of Israel, then there are issues or implications to completely neutralizing historical standards. Nonetheless, there's a new term which is becoming more and more popular in America. It's called Karov Yisrael, which is defined in a book called A Place in the Tent, published in California, as a friend or relative of Israel. And here I'm just going to get to the punchline, and I'm sorry if I move too slowly at the beginning, but here's the punchline. The punchline is that as the Marc and Chelseas of America join synagogues, and again, Marc's going to want to join a synagogue. He's going to want to bring up his child with Jewish identity. There will be more and more Krovei Yisrael. There will be more and more people who will occupy major synagogues throughout the United States who will not fit any halachic or legal definition of Judaism, including patrilineal. And it won't just be relatives. What happens if a couple divorces? Will the wife be thrown out of the synagogue? What happens if people who are not related to any Jews want to become a part of the synagogue? Will they be told, well, some non-Jews can and some non-Jews can't? Now, I'm sure every person in this room has an opinion on this. And I think that the point should be, there are two last points that I want to make. Is one, all the studies show, and this is really interesting, that if you have a family where there are two Jewish parents and a family with a Jewish parent and a non-Jewish parent, which will have a better chance of bringing up their kids Jewish? This one, except if this one isn't a synagogue member and this one is. If it comes down to synagogue membership, the intermarried family will have a better chance of bringing up their kids as Jews. So this issue is reshuffling the deck and redefining the ethnic church, which has been the conglomeration of Jewish identity for so many years. And so in this way, the new intermarried Jewish family, in a sense, is redefining the collective within the synagogue. Thank you very much.